Hey everyone, my name is Derek. I'm a law-abiding citizen and I own a gun. Several guns actually, but we'll get to that in a moment. More importantly, what I really want to discuss in this video is how I used to be pro-gun control, but now I'm pro-gun rights. Before the victory cries and the shaming begins from one side or the other, I want to talk about why I changed my mind. And yes, it is a free country. I can change my mind if I want to. This wasn't a decision I made overnight or something that just happened suddenly. It was something that gradually occurred over a period of time after listening to both sides, doing my own research, and eventually learning from my own experiences. First, let's talk about what I initially believed and why. Now, like a lot of people, when a mass shooting was shown on the news, I was instantly drawn to the details of the incident. How many people were shot? How many people died? What type of person would do this? Eventually, my thoughts would linger to what did they use to kill so many people? This question then leads to how did someone like that get their hands on firearms to begin with? And if enough emphasis is put on the weapon, as is often the case in the media today, I ask, how are these types of weapons available to civilians to begin with? This chain of thought is dangerous because it draws attention away from why an atrocity occurred to how is the atrocity carried out. And if you really want to be honest with yourself about preventing these kinds of tragedies, the most important question is why, not how. But sticking to that chain of thought, it made sense to say that if you want to prevent something from happening, take away the means. Now, I wasn't naive enough to believe that we can take away all firearms, but that didn't mean we couldn't impose restrictions or regulate them in a way that would prevent these sort of things from happening in the future. So then quick solutions were proposed to address these problems, which made sense to me at the time. If a particular firearm is perceived as too powerful, ban it. If the amount of ammunition in a magazine is overkill, limit it. If that's too much ammo or too many firearms for one person to own, restrict it. And if you want to monitor who's obtaining firearms, register it. Ultimately, my reasoning was, even with all these regulations, people can still own guns if they wanted to, and you can always grandfather in existing firearms and magazines as needed. This was my initial stance and thought process before I started to see things a little bit differently. Given everything that I believed in previously, it was also my belief that no matter how bad things can get, you can always call the police to stop the bad guys. After all, they're trained to uphold the law, deter crime, and stop criminals. However, I learned from others that this simply isn't the case. In the neighborhood where I live, there was recently a series of break-ins that occurred over the course of a few weeks. And this is by no means a bad part of town, trust me on that. One break-in occurred just next door, while my neighbor and his family were at home. Naturally, the police were called, but they didn't arrive until after they had already stolen what they wanted and made their getaway. That's when I realized that police simply can't be everywhere at once. They do their best, but in a time where law enforcement are starting to see more budget cuts, furloughs, and layoffs, how are the police supposed to do more with less? The answer is they can't. So after these burglaries occurred that struck quite literally close to home, I made the determination to go ahead and purchase my first firearm. In my mind, home defense was probably the most acceptable use for a firearm at the time. It's your home, your property, so what you do to defend your property is your business. Even then, I believed that a handgun or even a shotgun would be all that anyone should really need to defend their home. So I decided to opt for a handgun. Now, I didn't approach my first firearms purchase as a complete novice. My dad had taught me and my brothers how to shoot his handgun when I was younger, and growing up I had friends with .22s that we would use to go out plinking or target shooting. As far as handguns for use in personal defense, I was more familiar with the .45 caliber 1911. In deciding what I wanted for home defense, I figured I'd stick with a .45 caliber firearm, simply because it's what I was used to and it fires a big old bullet. However, as reliable as a 1911 is, I wanted something with more capacity, because if I'm really going to be honest with myself, anyone can be accurate with only 7 rounds in a controlled environment, like a shooting range. But throw in stress, low light, adrenaline, and your accuracy goes right out the window. Hence the reason I purchased this Glock 21. By the way, all the firearms I have in this video are safety checked and emptied, with no live ammunition in either the magazine or the chamber of the firearm itself. So yeah, there's no live ammunition around for safety purposes. I typically have all my firearms hidden, locked up, and stored separately from my ammunition, with one exception, which I'll get to later. Even though I don't have any children of my own, I have plenty of friends who do, and when they visit, I have my firearms stored in a manner that is safe from children. Now, going back to the Glock 21, with almost twice the capacity of a 1911, I thought it was more than enough firepower to protect myself in the event of a home invasion. I even purchased a weapon light for it so that I could positively identify targets in low light. My first gun purchase was a simple precaution I took on my part, so that in the event someone tries to break into my home, I'll still call the police, but at least I'll have something to protect me and my fiancée until help arrives. But after the shootings in Aurora and Tucson, I realized that criminals don't just strike at people's homes, and that mass murderers don't just attack schools. These people can choose to show up anywhere they'd like, especially in locations you'd think would be the last place people would get shot. That's when I decided that it may be time to consider getting a concealed carry permit. It was during this stage in becoming a gun owner that I really started to believe in gun rights. And just like my decision to purchase my first handgun, I did not make the decision to start carrying a firearm lightly. Like others in the pro-gun control camp, I initially thought that only police should have the ability to carry a weapon in public, and that no good can come from civilians carrying a weapon around on a day-to-day basis. The most common concern people bring up is that they don't want their neighborhoods turning into the Wild West. But I did my research on it just the same. I took a look at local and state laws regarding the carrying of firearms. I looked at the laws of neighboring states for good measure. I looked up actual instances where firearms were used in self-defense, and in doing so, I found numerous statistics regarding other law-abiding citizens who chose to carry. I once thought that civilians carrying firearms would be more prone to accidentally shooting an unintended target if faced with a situation where they needed to fire their weapon. This is the common concern brought up by those afraid to be caught up in a gunfight. But on the contrary, I found that police have an error rate of 11% versus the error rate of armed citizens at 2%. That means when faced with having to use firearms to protect themselves or others, police are 5 times more likely to hit an unintended target when compared to their armed civilian counterparts. This makes sense, since an armed citizen will oftentimes be in a position where they see a situation unfold before them and have a first-hand account of what's going on, whereas a police officer arriving on the scene must rely on information given to them by a dispatcher or someone else that may or may not be accurate. Also, just because someone is a law enforcement officer or in the military doesn't mean they're an expert marksman. Those in law enforcement and in the military are only required to qualify with a firearm once or twice a year unless they serve in a combat-oriented role. Their yearly qualification course is sometimes the only practice they get with a firearm. In my opinion, this is not how frequently people should be practiced with a firearm if they are in a role where they need to carry a weapon publicly for use in protecting others. In fact, most gun owners typically shoot as a hobby or for recreation and are oftentimes more practiced than law enforcement. Now, in addition, I thought that places that allow the carrying of firearms would likewise have higher rates of violent crime. Instead, I found the opposite, in that the overall crime rate has declined wherever carrying a firearm is legalized. I also discovered that polled felons are actually afraid of an armed victim more than they are afraid of the police. Again, this made sense if you think from a criminal's perspective. Would you commit a crime where you knew there was a possibility that others around you might be armed as well? This in turn brought my attention to gun-free zones. Every instance where the most horrific mass shootings took place were in locations designated as gun-free zones. All the school shootings and even the shooting in Aurora, I was surprised to find that of all the cinemas that he could have chosen to commit this horrible act, and there were several closer to him that he could have chosen, closer to where he lived, the murderer chose the only movie theater in the area that did not allow firearms. If there is anything criminals and mass murderers have in common, it's that they want an easy target. Even then, I believe that armed citizens couldn't possibly be more effective at stopping a mass shooter than the police. But again, I found that there is an average of only 2 deaths in a shooting rampage stopped by an armed citizen compared to 14 deaths in a rampage stopped by the police. This again goes back to the point that police can't be everywhere at once. Furthermore, I was surprised to find that among those who use a firearm to defend themselves, a vast majority of crimes are prevented without even firing a shot, and that the mere presentation of a firearm is enough to de-escalate a situation. What was even more encouraging to me was finding that Kennesaw, Georgia, close to where I live, passed a law that mandated heads of households own at least 1 firearm. Since that law passed, they've seen an 89% drop in burglaries. This isn't even a law that's realistically enforced, but it's enough to make criminals second-guess whether they want to break into a home in an area where the owner is more likely to be armed. What finally convinced me to get my concealed carry permit was listening to 911 calls. It's easy for someone who has never been the victim of crime to say they don't need a gun, but listening to a bunch of emergency calls to 911 was enough to convince me otherwise. Many of these calls are of people in their last moments before being robbed, beaten, raped, or killed. These victims will oftentimes struggle, scream for help, or beg for their lives. All the while, these people hear nothing on the other line from the operator except for an oftentimes empty promise that help is on the way. I was not only convinced to go ahead and get my concealed carry permit, but I helped my fiancée get one too. I'd be damned if I wasn't going to give her the same fighting chance at life should her life be threatened. If I'm not there to protect her, or worse, if something were to happen to me. Going through the process of getting a weapon carry permit was a fairly time-consuming affair, and a process that I quickly realized was pretty stupid. My state isn't even the most difficult state to obtain a permit. Compared to some states, the process I went through was painless. Nevertheless, it made me think, what criminal will fill out all the legal paperwork, pay all the required fees, get themselves fingerprinted, expose themselves to a background check, and go through the necessary training required in some states just so that they can legally carry a gun? The answer is they won't. All a criminal does is get a gun, which they may or may not own legally to begin with, stick it in their waistband, hide it under a shirt, jacket, or hoodie, and start carrying a weapon without telling anyone. Meanwhile, my fiancé and I, along with every other law-abiding citizen, go through all these legal hurdles just so that we can defend ourselves from those who are illegally armed to begin with. Regardless, once we had both applied for our carry permit, I decided to get another firearm that was easier to carry than the larger Glock 21 I was already using for home defense. Likewise, I purchased a firearm for my fiancé as well. We both opted for the Glock 27. Now, this is the one firearm that I own that is the exception to the rule among all my other weapons. This handgun is always loaded with a round in the chamber, except for right now, of course. However, unlike my other firearms, this is always on my person, so I don't have to worry about a child or someone else finding it and accidentally discharging it. Just to reassure you, it's empty, just like my Glock 21. Now, we also bought conversion barrels for both of our subcompact handguns so that we could share ammunition or switch to a more manageable or more powerful caliber as needed. As an added benefit, we both found an activity we could both enjoy together. We went to the shooting range, took classes, and became proficient at marksmanship, maintenance, and the safe handling of our firearms. I started going to the shooting range more frequently because I felt that if I was going to be carrying a firearm in public, at the very least, I owed it to myself and others around me that if I may be faced with a life-threatening situation where I have to discharge my weapon, I should at least be a decent shot. Over time, what initially began as going to the range for practice soon turned into going for the simple enjoyment of it. I quickly became a regular at the range that I was going to. I went once every 1 or 2 weeks so that I could stay relatively well practiced, and I eventually found myself looking forward to going to the range. Dare I say I found shooting to be fun. However, if I was going to go to the range more often and shoot recreationally, I needed a new firearm. My Glock 21 is great for home defense, but the cost of shooting .45 caliber ammo all the time can be pretty expensive. I can convert my Glock 27 to shoot cheaper 9mm ammo, but I wanted something with a longer barrel to make hitting distant targets more manageable. That's when I decided to purchase a Glock 22. Now, just like the handgun I use for concealed carry, I bought a conversion barrel for it so that I could switch back and forth between different calibers. Because of the longer barrel and sight radius, I was able to hit targets at longer distances with better accuracy. When I first started going to the shooting range, I was practicing on targets between 7 and 10 yards, which is realistically the farthest distances that I would engage a threat in most self-defense situations. Now, I find myself practicing on targets out to 15 and 25 yards just to further test my marksmanship with a handgun. By this time, I was more comfortable and confident with carrying a firearm. The fact that I carried a gun on me didn't really change the way I went about my life on a day-to-day basis. If anything, I feel it made me a better citizen. Now, by better citizen, I don't mean that I started fighting crime side by side with the police. Rather, I found myself staying up to date on laws and ordinances regarding firearms. Although it's lawful for me to openly carry a firearm, I continue to conceal carry out of consideration for others around me who I know might be like I once was and feel uncomfortable around someone with a gun. I started conversing with law enforcement that I would encounter in public and learn from them how to best handle the situation where I would need to disclose to police that I was legally armed. I have yet to run into a police officer who was against citizens carrying firearms for self-defense. In fact, I oftentimes find them encouraging it because it deters criminals from committing crimes and gives citizens the chance to protect themselves until police arrive. As an unintended consequence, I started exercising my political right as a citizen again. Before becoming a gun owner, I confess that the only time I ever participated in the political process was when I was younger, living in Florida. Being a battleground state that could go either way in a presidential election, I felt it was the only time that my vote would really matter. Even then, I only paid attention to presidential votes. I didn't pay attention to local government or laws on the ballot. I would oftentimes just vote for someone solely based on their party affiliation and nothing else. However, the necessity of knowing the law as a gun owner helped me return to being involved in the political process. I registered to vote again. I paid attention to new or proposed legislation. I studied how similar legislation affected other states. I researched elected officials and their voting history, all of which helped me make more informed decisions as a citizen and a voter. But the most controversial decision I would make would come in the form of my most recent firearms purchase. After purchasing several handguns and becoming proficient with them at the indoor range that I frequented, I decided to try something new. I went to an outdoor range for the first time, which allowed me the opportunity to try things that I otherwise was prohibited from doing at an indoor range. First, I was finally able to test myself on targets farther than the 25 yards I was limited to indoors. Second, I was able to practice actually drawing from my holster, which is especially important for those who carry on a daily basis. Being a good marksman doesn't help if you can't draw your weapon in a safe and quick manner to address a threat. Third, it allowed me to practice other skills that would be useful in an emergency situation, including quick reloads, clearing induced malfunctions, shooting from different stances or positions, and so on. However, my next firearms purchase was more heavily influenced by my desire to try shooting at longer distances. Realistically, 25 to 30 yards is the farthest that you want to engage targets with a handgun. But a lot more goes into shooting at 100, 200, 300 yards and more. Therefore, I knew I wanted a rifle. The only question was, which one? One of the biggest factors that influences my firearms purchases is availability and price of ammunition. Going to most gun stores and even places like Walmart, I found that the most common rifle ammunition was the .223 Remington or 5.56 by 45 millimeter NATO round, which are essentially the same round with the exception of differing gas pressures. However, this choice in ammunition in a sense brought me full circle, because a vast majority of the firearms I could select that fired that particular round were based on the AR-15 platform. This weapon was used in the Aurora and Newtown shootings, which amassed some of the highest body counts in a mass shooting in our nation's history. This was the very gun that not too long ago I questioned why anyone would need it. But like any buying decision, I did my research like always. Among the benefits I found was its modular design. There were so many aftermarket parts and accessories I could add to customize the firearm to how I'd use it. It came in various barrel lengths for close quarters or long distance shooting. Numerous manufacturers were available and offered mil-spec and commercial features to suit anyone's budget. After spending enough time researching, I came to another realization that stripped away my previous beliefs about these types of firearms. I ignored all the available accessories out there and just looked at the firing mechanism itself. This was a semi-automatic firearm. One pull of the trigger expended one bullet. Contrary to popular belief, fully automatic rifles are already illegal or heavily regulated and registered. Even though it looked like the M16s and the M4s used by the military, it wasn't the same firearm. Like my handguns, this rifle would only allow me to fire as fast as my trigger finger would allow. It fires a bullet that's not nearly as large or as powerful as many hunting rifles or other semi-automatic rifles available in the market. Now, again, I don't have any live ammunition around for safety purposes. The last thing I want to do is unintentionally chamber a round into one of my firearms and accidentally discharge it. Some of you may laugh, but when you practice something enough to the point where it becomes second nature, it's very easy to do it without realizing it. So I'll be using empty casings to illustrate my next point here. So right here is a AA battery, which we'll be using as a point of reference so that you know how big these bullets are. So this is a 380 automatic Colt pistol round, which is commonly used in most subcompact or pocket handguns. This is a 9mm round, which is probably the most common handgun round in use today. This is what my fiancée prefers in her personal handgun for self-defense, and one I typically use for target practice. This is the casing for a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson cartridge, which is what I use for my concealed carry handgun. It's bigger than the 9mm round, which gives it a little more punch, but still allows me to carry more rounds than my .45. This is a .45 caliber automatic Colt pistol round, which is even bigger and is what I use in my home defense handgun. Ideally, I would love to use this in my concealed carry firearm, but I'd rather have higher capacity versus the added stopping power. Finally, we have the casing for the 5.56 millimeter NATO round, which is what is used by the AR-15. Although the casing looks bigger and scarier, the diameter and weight of the actual bullet is less than the handgun rounds I've just shown you. Yes, it travels much faster than the handgun bullets, but wait until I show you these last couple rounds I have. Here we have the .270 Winchester, which is a popular caliber among deer hunters. It's a more powerful round, used for big game hunting like moose or elk. People oftentimes claim that no one needs an AR-15 for hunting, and in a way this is true. Hunters go for larger, more powerful bullets that, if used on a person, would be utterly devastating. The .223 can still be used for hunting, but oftentimes it's used on smaller game and more commonly used in competition shooting. And to really illustrate my point, here's the casing for a .50 caliber BMG, or Browning machine gun. A lot of anti-gun folks may think this must be illegal to own, but it isn't. Even with some of the proposed semi-automatic weapons bans out there are rifles out there that would not be restricted under those proposed bans, and that use this very round. This is a bullet that, if used on a person, will tear the human body apart. Our military uses this in machine guns and in heavier sniper rifle platforms because of its ability to punch through armor and be effective out to distances exceeding 1.5 miles. The longest confirmed sniper kill was achieved using a weapon platform that fired this very round. Some of you may ask why anyone would need a bullet this big, but in reality this caliber is common among those who like to practice extremely long distance marksmanship. Shooting ranges oftentimes have them so that folks can have fun seeing what it's like to shoot such a large platform. When advocating for gun control, many argue for the banning of one type of firearm over another because it's perceived as being more dangerous. In actuality, all firearms, no matter the caliber, are equally dangerous and need to be treated with respect, and you can't simply restrict a firearm based on its looks. This piqued my curiosity and made me take a second look at the previously proposed firearms restrictions that I had once agreed with. Not a single piece of legislation addressed the mechanics of a firearm or the ballistics of the bullet it fires. Like my own initial observations, people who wanted to ban these weapons were only looking at the cosmetic features. These features did nothing more than customize a firearm to the user's liking, aesthetically and ergonomically, and in no way affects the weapon's performance. Knowing that the AR-15 met my personal requirements in a rifle that I wanted, that prices were at an all-time low, and that prices would increase again once the possibility of gun control is inevitably brought up in the future, I decided to purchase an AR-15 while I still had the chance. This is my personal AR-15. The accessories I've chosen for it are geared toward it being used in close to medium range to essentially fill in the distances where I couldn't use my handguns at the shooting range. It's got a collapsible stock, which is used to adjust it accordingly to someone's body type. This comes in handy when I go shooting with my fiance or friends and family, so that others can comfortably shoot this firearm just as well as I can. It's got an electronic optic, which makes target acquisition a lot easier, along with flip-up sights in case the optic fails or runs out of batteries. I mounted an angled foregrip here so that I can comfortably hold the rifle with my support hand, and I've also included a weapon light so that I can use it in low light for home defense if needed. In all likelihood, I'll continue to use my handgun for home defense, But it's good to know that if I can only get my hands on this in an emergency, then I can still use it for the same application. Many of these features are the focus of so-called assault weapons bans, but these are cosmetic features only and do not affect the actual mechanics of the rifle in any way. In fact, here's an ingenious accessory that was developed just to get around the bans that were passed in places like New York and California. As you can see, they simply adjusted or eliminated the banned scary-looking features so that the weapon is still in compliance with the law, but it still functions the same. So you can't just ban firearms based on how they look. Although I still regularly train with my handguns, I find myself using my AR-15 more at the range when it comes to recreational shooting. Those of you who are against firearms may be surprised to know how relaxing it is to shoot. Like archery, a lot of focus goes into trying to shoot a small or distant target. You learn to control your breathing, slow your heart rate, focus on your front sight post or reticle on the target. It's taken a step further when you're outdoors and you have to also adjust for wind speed, humidity, gravity, and all the other factors in physics that will affect the trajectory of your bullet. If everything is done right, and you've taken the time to know yourself and the firearm, you're rewarded with a direct hit on your intended target. The only difference between this and archery is that I can't loose an arrow as far or as fast as a bullet, let alone carry around a bow and arrow for self-defense. So don't even try to persuade me to take up archery as an alternative hobby. Researching and shopping for my AR-15 taught me other things regarding gun control as well. For one, as easy as it is to place blame on an inanimate object, the gun isn't the problem. Like any tool or object, guns are at the mercy of the user's will. My firearms have only ever been used at designated shooting ranges for recreational or training purposes, and hopefully it stays that way. The only other time I'd be willing to discharge my weapon is in self-defense, and I honestly hope that the day never comes where I may need to test that. However, placing the same firearm in the hands of someone with criminal or murderous intent will obviously change how the gun is used. But again, this is not the fault of the gun. It's the person using it. Just the same as it is the fault of the individual who misuses a car, a knife, a baseball bat, a hammer, or any other instrument that can cause harm to others if used in a malicious or reckless manner. And unfortunately, you can't legislate away evil. Creating laws that ban or restrict firearms only affects the people who will obey the law, which are the people you shouldn't be worried about to begin with. People blame the AR-15 for causing so much death, yet the deadliest shooting in U.S. history was carried out by someone with a couple handguns at Virginia Tech. The deadliest mass shooting in history occurred in Norway back in 2011, where 69 people were killed using firearms that would not have been restricted under any of the proposed bans here in the U.S. Rifles account for fewer deaths in the U.S. than knives, blunt objects, or hands and feet. Even if we try going after all guns, you'll still have weapons being distributed through illegal channels. Whether it's against the law or not, criminals will find a way to obtain firearms if they really want it. Therefore, a ban will only ensure that criminals are the only ones who are armed. That's when some argue that we should have universal background checks for all firearm sales, including private transactions. However, the only way to enforce that would be to register all firearms, which is something that you'll find difficult for most people to comply with, let alone criminals who oftentimes file down the serial number on their firearms so that it can't be traced. Even if universal background checks are possible, it would not have prevented any of the mass shootings that have occurred recently. All the firearms used in the most recent and horrific mass shootings were purchased legally with a background check. The shooters in Isla Vista, Aurora, Tucson, Virginia Tech, they all passed background checks because they didn't have a previous criminal history. Even the shooter in Newtown was able to get his hands on firearms despite his mental illness because they were purchased legally by his mother, who passed a required background check. The only thing background checks accomplish in these shootings is show where these guns originated from after the crime had already been carried out, which is pointless if the goal is to prevent mass shootings from happening in the first place. Then there are those who want to limit magazine capacity to 10 rounds. New York went as far as limiting it to 7 rounds, with the justification that more frequent reloads will provide others the opportunity to get away or tackle the shooter. If that were to become law, all of the magazines I own would be illegal. The lowest magazine capacity in my possession is 13, and no one is in a position to tell me how many shots I may or may not need to defend myself from one or multiple attackers. And I highly doubt criminals who may already own a gun illegally will also choose to follow a magazine capacity restriction. California has a high-capacity magazine ban, but in the Isla Vista shootings, more than half of the shooter's victims were stabbed or hit with his car, and those that were shot with 10-round magazines. He simply made up for his limited magazine capacity by having multiple loaded handguns at once, or using other means of causing damage via his car or knife. These proposed solutions were all measures that I had once thought of as reasonable, but after educating myself more thoroughly, having taken the time to become more familiar with firearms, and taking a second look at what I previously believed, every proposed solution that I've seen and at one time supported is based on misconceptions, misinformation, and the assumption that everyone will play by the rules. Unfortunately, this isn't the case. Reality has shown that there will always be those who have no respect for the law or the lives and property of others. Furthermore, all of these proposed restrictions and bans have been implemented in other states and countries with no success. California, New York, Illinois, Connecticut, and Washington, D.C., among others, should be the safest places in the country since they have the strictest gun laws in the nation. Yet they suffer the most in terms of violent crime. The UK and Australia have banned all handguns and semi-automatic firearms respectively, and soon after saw violent crime increase by almost 70%. It can be argued that these two countries no longer have mass shootings, but what is the point in preventing one mass shooting when all you've done is embolden other criminals and increase the overall number of violent crimes and murders? There's even a group of doctors in the UK who are pushing for a ban on pointed kitchen knives due to the dramatic increase in stabbings. Is that what we have to look forward to if these kinds of bans and restrictions are pushed through because of an emotional reaction without any sort of reasoning or forethought? If you take out the gun and gun violence, you still have violence. Therefore, if the goal is to reduce or eliminate all violence, we need to address the root cause and not just the tool being used in violent acts. Until you can guarantee the elimination of violence at the individual and international level, until police and other emergency services can develop a means of instantly transporting themselves to where they're needed at exactly the time they're needed, and until you can guarantee the protection of all other freedoms outlined in the Bill of Rights without the need of an armed citizenry to deter their infringement, until that day comes to fruition, I will continue to exercise my right to keep and bear arms. I hope this provides some of you out there who are for gun rights with a little insight into why those of us who are or were for gun control think the way we do, or did in my case. I'd like to think that behind it all, most of those who are pro-gun control are well-intentioned. However, their stance, which did include me at one point, may be based on misinformation, personal assumptions, or even just a fear of firearms in general. We should continue to host open discussions about these issues on both sides, and neither side should resort to name-calling or shutting out the other simply because they bring up a point that counters what the other believes. Likewise, for those of you who are currently pro-gun control, I only ask that you don't jump to conclusions about those who do exercise their Second Amendment right. Statistically and personally speaking, the vast majority of gun owners are some of the safest and most law-abiding individuals you may ever encounter. Odds are, while you've gone about your day-to-day lives, you've probably met many gun owners and even people who have a concealed firearm and you don't even know it. Just because a handful of evil people choose to commit these horrible acts doesn't mean that everyone else should be shamed or punished for it. To both sides, I say do your own research. When you see a statistic from someone online or in the media, find out where that statistic is from, when it was collected, and who collected it. I did my best to cross-reference statistics I found with up-to-date and unbiased sources such as the FBI or UK Home Office. Explore both sides of the issue to see where the opposition is coming from. You might be surprised by what you discover simply by looking at the flip side of the issue. And I apologize about the length of this particular video. However, I knew that there would inevitably be questions from both sides, and I figured I'd try to address as many of those potential questions as possible before they're even asked. I'm lazy, so sue me. Still, if you do have any questions, or if you just want to open a discussion, use the comments section below. I only ask that you try to keep the discussion as civilized as possible. Thanks everyone, and stay safe.